Since Venezuela's disputed presidential election, discussions are ongoing with the aim to find a solution to the country's political crisis. With me, I have Miguel Nunes Silva, Director of Trezeno Institute and local councilman. Welcome back to RIX Europe.
Thank you once again, Rebecca, for having me.
So could you give us the context of this Venezuelan political crisis, so to speak?
So Venezuela historically was a very interesting country. The whole of Latin America was very impoverished in general. They were far from major trade routes, and they were not as easily productive, say, as, for example, the United States. The United States is a flat country with lots of agricultural potential, and its ports are closer to Europe. And Latin America was the opposite. There was lots of mountains and tropical forests. It was far from Europe. So historically, the most productive areas were the Caribbean and on the coasts, because they could have coffee plantations there and coffee plantations. But inland, it was very impoverished, and it stayed that way until the 20th century. The one exception became Argentina and Chile. They were very wealthy countries, even for European standards. Some of them attracted European immigration precisely because they were more prosperous than Western Europe at one point. And why? Because, again, they were flat and they could have high intensity crops in Southern Europe, in Southern America, sorry. Now, Venezuela had the same difficulties as other countries, but because it had been, relatively speaking, more stable, and because they were close to the Caribbean and they had ports that were close to the United States, they were far more prosperous. So they were richer than Brazil. They were richer than all of their neighbors, Colombia. Colombia is a good comparison because up to the 1990s, Colombia had civil conflicts, the fight against guerrillas, against the drug trade, and Venezuela had not. Venezuela had been at peace. So if people wanted to immigrate within South America, they would go to Venezuela. And in fact, there is a large Portuguese descendant community in Venezuela to this day. People who were very poor, they were poor in Madeira, in the Madeira Islands, in the Azores, and in Portugal, and they immigrated to Venezuela. So there are hundreds of thousands of Portuguese descendants in Venezuela to this day. Now, Venezuela was, of course, like other Latin American countries, somewhat corrupt. But in spite of everything, at least comparatively, less corrupt and more prosperous than other countries. All of that changed in the 2000s when the Venezuelans decided to elect Hugo Chavez for the presidency. Hugo Chavez, being a Marxist, began to nationalize the economy. He nationalized the oil sector first. He mismanaged the oil sector, but he also distributed its profits amongst some of the poor population. That came to cause inflation. And eventually the supermarkets were punished by the government. They were taken over by the government in order to stave off the inflation so they could fix prices. And that, of course, in turn caused the destruction of the supermarket, the distribution system. So the whole of the Venezuelan economy was completely turned into chaos with Hugo Chavez. And because the Chavez regime had a lot of ties with the military, they knew that if they allowed free and fair elections, that the results would not be necessarily very favorable. There was a point in Venezuela's history, political history, where the government even went to the extent of creating a parallel parliament because they couldn't pass their legislation in the regular old parliament. So Venezuela has been a mess. It has been in economic chaos since the 2000s. And now that with this election, people had more hopes that there could be some change. Maduro is not as popular as Chavez. And for the first time, you had Russia distracted with other parts of the world, with Ukraine. So they wouldn't necessarily have someone to give them a helping hand economically. So China and Russia are focused on other things. And on the other hand, America is not there to, because also recently the Biden administration tried to improve relations with Venezuela precisely because to counterbalance the loss of access to Russian energy resources. And so again, Venezuela was somewhat isolated. Maduro was not particularly popular. And we knew from previous polls, opinion polls in Venezuela, that most people were willing to vote for the opposition. Until now, the opposition had been somewhat divided. The candidates were not necessarily very charismatic, but now in 2024, there would be a chance to change things. Of course, all of this was contingent on the democratic elections being respected, and so the results being respected. And what everyone is now denouncing and claiming is that the government has forged the results of the elections. So they knew they were going to lose, they fixed the elections, and this is how they won the 51% victory for Maduro. Now, I don't know if this is accurate or not, if he won or not. No one can actually know without looking at the internals of the election. But what we do have many reasons to suspect and high suspicion of is that the government was not playing fair. It was not a clean election. That being the case, it creates a crisis because it can happen. Again, this is all going to depend ultimately on the military, on whether the military are willing to continue to support the regime or not. The regime has been buying off the top leadership of the military for the past 2 decades. So not much hope for change there. But if some military men decide that they cannot withstand the pressure of the people, of the population, they may decide to not support the government anymore, so to desert the socialist system. But all of that, I think, would be made much easier if there were international entities demanding this. And for the time being, the only countries that are not that are putting somewhat diplomatic pressure on Venezuela, a certain amount of it, are Latin American countries. So even Brazil is not entirely on the side of Maduro. Even Maduro's left-wing allies in Chile are not entirely on his side. And several countries, starting with Argentina and I believe Ecuador as well, are simply not recognizing the results of the election. Of course, if Maduro resists, if he stays in power for the next month, 2 months, 6 months, then people will have no other choice but to accept that he rules Venezuela. It doesn't matter whether he rules it democratically or not, he rules it. But for the time being, the situation is tense because the regime fears that some people within Venezuela may try to overthrow the government. Let's put it that way.
There's been said that there's some sort of informal involvement. You mentioned in support with Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico. How effective could this be in resolving the crisis?
Well, I suppose from their point of view, what they could hope was to negotiate an agreement, a power-sharing agreement between the government and the opposition. So if we know that the majority of the population is on the side of the opposition, but the military are on the side of the regime, if we could give something, a few positions here and there, or a few concessions in terms of policy to the opposition, maybe they could tolerate the regime for another 4 years. Or 5 years. So that would be the hope. But I think the problem is at the moment that there aren't a lot of incentives for the Maduro regime to give concessions because they know that if they wait long enough, the opposition will disperse. So they won't have the ability to oppose the government forever. And what we see is that the Maduro regime is so comfortable that they have started imprisoning leaders of the opposition.
Thank you, Miguel Nunes Silva, Director of Trezeno Institute and local councilman, for your insights.
Thank you very much, Rebecca.
And thank you for watching Riks Europe.